Good evening. My name is Dylan Robbins. I'm the director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at NYU. On behalf of my team and that of Espacio de Culturas, we'd like to welcome all of you to this inaugural event of this year's Andrés Bello Chair in Latin American Culture and Civilization, Professor DJAMILA Ribeiro. We also want to thank Boston University's Center for Anti-Racist Research for partnering with us for tonight's program and express our gratitude to the staff of the Cantor Film Center for their support, as well as several folks who've been working behind the scenes at KJCC, especially to make this event possible. Before we begin, I'd like to call up to the stage two students from the Center of Latin American and Caribbean Studies Master of Arts program. The first will be João Victor Azevedo, who will now read to you a brief text, followed by Floria Herrero, who will then also read. Please, João Victor.
Quero começar reconhecendo o fato do nosso centro repousa na terra natal do povo indígena Lenape Mahanatá. Uma vez que estamos aqui reunidos hoje, peço a vocês que nos juntemos no reconhecimento da comunidade Lenape Mahanatá, suas gerações passadas, presentes e futuras. Manhattan deriva da palavra Mahanatá, que significa ilha de muitas colinas, igual ao nosso país, igual ao país caribenho Haiti, que é, aliás, uma palavra com significado parecido em um país cuja língua, o crioulo haitiano, se ensina aqui no centro. E também, nesse território dos antigos Lenape Mahanatá, hoje se ensina a língua e a cultura do outro povo ancestral, a língua quechua dos Andes.
Quiero iniciar sopesando el hecho de que nuestro centro se erige sobre una superficie de la nación ancestral Lenape Menahata. Porque estamos reunidos hoy en este recinto, les pido que se unan a nosotros, las generaciones pasadas y futuras, para ponderar a esta antigua comunidad. Manhattan proviene de Manahata, que significa isla con montículos. Y sobre este territorio de los Lenape Manahata se enseña ahora la lengua y cultura a otra antigua nación, el lenguaje quechua de los Andes.
I'd like to start by acknowledging that our center rests on indigenous Lenape Manhattan homeland, and as we gather in this space, we ask that you join us in acknowledging the Lenape Manhattan community, elders both past and present, as well as future generations. Manhattan derives from Manhattan, which means hilly island, just like the name Haiti, which is a Taino word of similar meaning, and a place whose people's language, Creole, is taught here, and also too, in the territory of the ancient Lenape Manhattan, the language and culture of another ancient nation is taught today, the Quechua language of the Andes. I'd like to thank Professors Odi Gonzalez, a Quechua instructor who founded the Quechua language program at the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies 16 years ago, for his work in creating this text, as well as Professor Winnie Lamore, who's now celebrating building a program over the last 10 years of Haitian Creole, one of the few academic programs in the language in the United States, for also her work in not only creating this program, but also creating this text in this land acknowledgement. Officially inaugurated in December of 2001, the Andrés Bello Chair in Latin American Cultures and Civilizations was established at NYU's KJCC. The endowed chair honors the Venezuelan-born humanist, poet, scholar, diplomat, and public intellectual Andrés Bello. Essayist, historian, and linguistic and legal scholar, Bello wrote poetry, history, legal works, and was a remarkable scholar of the Spanish language. As a philologist, he compiled one of the most important Spanish modern grammars for the Americas. Andrés Bello is also remembered as the founder of the University of Chile and a great promulgator of Chile's civil code. While at NYU, Professor Ribeiro is offering a graduate seminar on feminisms from the South, and she will also lead two more public events. Later, a conversation with Selma Delgina and Alessandra Devusky on October 15th, which will be in Portuguese and introduced by NYU's Honey Crawford of the Department of English. Subsequently, a conversation on October 29th, entitled Feminist Epistemologies in the Global South, with Linda Alcoff, will be introduced by the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, Professor Gabriela Basterra. Tonight's program is a very special conversation, here between Professors Ribeiro and Kendi, about race in Brazil and the United States. It will be followed by a brief period of Q&A with the audience. We'll place the microphone right there in the middle. The discussion enriches the dialogue between Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist of 2019 and Ribeiro's Pequeno Manual Antirracista, also of 2019, while celebrating the English language edition of Ribeiro's book Lugar de Fala, translated now into English as Where We Stand and published by Yale University Press. I'm honored to present to you today these two distinguished scholars. Professor DJAMILA Ribeiro is a public intellectual, a philosopher, and a journalist. She has called upon and pushed further the very rich and unique tradition of Brazilian social thought, with very particular attention to legacies and insights of a line of Black feminist Brazilian intellectuals like Lélia Gonçalves and Sueli Carneiro, among others. She holds degrees in philosophy and political philosophy from the Federal University of São Paulo and has held teaching appointments in journalism at the Pontifical Catholic University of São Paulo and is a guest lecturer at the University of Mainz in Germany. Her scholarly production includes The Place of Speech. Well, now it's translated not as The Place of Speech, as so that was my initial provision. That was before it was translated in English, so I apologize. Who's Afraid of Black Feminism of 2018 and Short Anti-Racist Guide 2019, which was awarded the 2020 Jabuti Prize in the Human Sciences category, and finally Letters to My Grandmother of 2021. As a journalist, she has published in a variety of prestigious venues in Brazil, including as a regular contributor and columnist for the Folha de São Paulo. Yet her scholarly vision is one shaped and driven by expanding the readership for critical ideas, which is certainly one of the motives behind her ambitious editorial project of Plural Feminisms, which aims to bring accessible discussions of critical thought to even more readers. She is the recipient of numerous accolades and recognitions in Brazil, Europe, and the United States, including honors from the Paulista Academia of Letters, the United Nations General Assembly, and the Inter-American Dialogue at the headquarters of the Organization of American States. Dr. Ibram Kendi is a National Book Award-winning author of, count them, 16 books for adults and children, including 10 New York Times bestsellers, 5 of which were #1 New York Times bestsellers. Dr. Kendi is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor in the Humanities at Boston University and the Director of the Boston University Center for Anti-Racist Research, which is a unique, multidisciplinary research and education collaborative that works across the disciplines to forward racial equity and social justice. He is a contributing editor, moreover, at The Atlantic, and a CBS News racial justice contributor. Dr. Kendi is the author of Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, which won the National Book Award for Nonfiction, making him the youngest author to win the award. He also authored the international bestseller, How to Be an Anti-Racist, which was described in the New York Times as, and I quote, the most courageous book to date on the problem of race in the Western mind. Dr. Kendi's other bestsellers include How to Raise an Anti-Racist and Anti-Racist Baby, illustrated by Ashley Lukashevsky. In 2020, Time magazine named Dr. Kendi one of the 100 most influential people in the world. He was awarded, finally, a 2021 MacArthur Fellowship, otherwise known as the Genius Grant. Please join me in welcoming this evening to NYU and to all of you, Professors Ibram Kendi and Professor DJAMILA Ribeiro.
Good evening. Good evening. Okay. Thank you, Professor Dylan, for the introduction. First of all, I'd like to thank Ibram for accepting our invitation. It's such a joy for us to have you tonight. I really, truly admire your work, your book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, was an inspiration for my book in Brazil, a short anti-racist manual. So for us, but for me especially, it's such a great joy to be in a conversation with you. I'd like to thank the KJCC Center and the Latin American Studies Department for organizing this beautiful event. I'd like to thank the students that are taking my classes because I saw that they are here. So we are going to ask questions to each other. So I'd like to begin with a question that today I presented your work for some of the students, and some questions pop up, especially regards to the term racist policy, because we are more familiar, especially in Brazil, with the term structural racism or systemic racism. So do you mind to explain to us why do you think that racist policy is a term that bring all these concepts together?
Sure. Well, good evening, everyone. Jamila, I'm so glad we're able to have this conversation. I think that Black intellectuals, particularly anti-racist Black intellectuals, really need to have these transnational dialogues. We really need to be learning from each other, because I think the more we understand racism in other countries, the more we'll understand racism in our own country, and more we'll be able to understand the way in which racism operates as a sort of global construct. And I'm also deeply admiring of your work on feminism, and to be able to sort of stand and speak about both feminism and racism, in Brazil, and certainly their intersection is certainly something, that I admire. But to your question, so there's two different things that's happening here. The first is when I think of terms, I'm constantly thinking of everyday people and terms that can better hold meaning with everyday people, that can allow them to understand the way that, let's say, element of racism is operating within their own lives. And so as it relates to structural racism versus, let's say, a term like racist policies, at least when I've been speaking about racism and I would sort of talk to regular people and use the term structural racism, it was typically a term that I had to explain, while the term racist policy was a term that I didn't have to spend as much time explaining. And so for me, I think it's just incredibly important for us to use terms that carry meaning. The other thing I think it's also critical is I've realized that people tend to use the term racism and racist interchangeably. In other words, I don't think many people have a different conception of the term racist than they do the term racism. And the reason why that comes into play is because if we start to think about, okay, what is this sort of difference between the term racist and the term racism, I would argue we can begin to see that racism is inherently structural, inherently systemic, and inherently institutional, while the term racist is singular. So we're talking about a single idea or a single policy or even a person who is being, let's say, racist. And I think the reason why that's important is because one of the things I think we're also hopefully trying to do is to talk about how the individual is operating within this larger structure, and negotiating this larger structure, reinforcing or even challenging this larger structure. So I think it's important for us to allow the individual to understand how they can negotiate with that larger structure. But the first way in which we do that is we say that racism is inherently structural. And then finally, from an historical standpoint, the term structural racism comes out of the term institutional racism, which came really from a book in the US context called Black Power by Stokely Carmichael, in which he went about distinguishing between what he called individual racism from institutional racism. And the reason why that delineation was important was because he wanted people to understand the ways in which, I think he gave a specific example of how in Birmingham, Alabama, so many young kids are dying of a particular sort of illness who are Black versus an individual who is being subjected to, let's say, Klan violence. So one is more interpersonal, while the other is more structural and institutional. And he was arguing in 1966 that more and more Americans were imagining racism as individual and no longer able to understand the way that it was institutional.
Now I guess the students understood. Yes, it was a great explanation. Thank you for that.
But I have a question for you.
Yes, yeah. Because I couldn't explain during the class. Thank you.
So you mentioned that I think in Brazil, the term structural racism is becoming more and more popular, and which is to say that I guess more and more people are understanding the way in which racism is structural. But I also know there was been a while where people denied, its existence. And so how did that come about? Like how has it been such that more and more people are understanding and even potentially even recognizing the structure of racism in Brazil?
Well, I will explain a little bit about the Brazilian context because maybe there are people here that are not familiar to this. Brazil was the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery in 1888. For almost 354 years of slavery time in Brazil. But after the slavery time, the Brazilian state haven't created any kind of public policies to include the Black population, what you call the industrialization process of Brazil. So they encourage European people to come to Brazil to accomplish a politics known as the whitening policy. And these people came to Brazil. Of course, they came poor, they have to work, but many of them received lands to start their lives in Brazil. So the Italian community, German community. So the Brazilian state donated lands to these people. And at the same time, all that Black people stayed apart from citizenship anyhow. And after that time, they created the idea of racial democracy myth, which is a romanticized idea that in Brazil there is no racial conflict. So in Brazil we are not racist like United States or South Africa because we are all a mixed people. And here in Brazil the problem is only a class problem, not a racial problem. So for a long time, this idea was imposed in Brazil, and many intellectuals and writers in Brazil shaped their ideas based on the racial democracy myth. And the work of the Black liberation movement was very important to confront this idea and to make the Brazilian state acknowledge that racism was a problem in our country. So for a long time, the denial of racism was imposed for us. And many people believed that, even Black people, we are all mixed. There are a lot of people in Brazil, light-skinned Black people, for example, that don't see themselves as Black, for example, because of that. And many intellectuals like Kabengele Munanga, who is a professor, he is retired now, but he's from Congo, but he made his career in Brazil. And he used to say that racism in Brazil is a perfect crime because it's very sophisticated. So for almost 400 years, there were slavery in Brazil. And then after that, there is no racism in Brazil. We do not have to create anti-race policies because there is no racism. So this is our context in Brazil. And if today we are talking about structural racism in Brazil, if the racism in the public debate in Brazil, it's due to the historical work of the Black movements and the Black intellectuals in Brazil who worked a lot to raise awareness on that. And for example, only in 2001, the Brazilian state recognized that slavery was a crime against humanity. Just in 2001, during the Durban Conference in South Africa. So after that recognition, they started to adopt quotas in some universities in Brazil. The first one was the State University of Rio de Janeiro in 2001. The second one was the State University of Bahia in 2003. And then University of Brasilia in 2004. And in 2012, they established quotas in all federal universities in Brazil. So first, the recognition came, and then they create reparation policy. So this denial of racism, it was a very sophisticated way to not create anti-racist policies and to keep Black population apart from rights, access to rights in Brazil. But today I'm very, of course, we had Bolsonaro in Brazil, we have a lot of problems in Brazil, but I think it's important, yes, we had. Well, but I think it's important to say...
We have a lot of problems.
Yeah. But I think it's important to highlight how today in Brazil, people are speaking about that. Especially because of work of people in the editorial market that started to publish Black people, including me, because I do that in Brazil. And I published a book called Structural Racism, written by a Black author in Brazil. And because my goal as a publisher was to spread, the ideas and to break these bubbles, these academic bubbles, and invite people to conversation. So if today we are talking about these terms are more popular in Brazil, it's because the work of the Black liberation movement, for sure. Another question to you? No, but okay. I have some notes here, because English is not my first language, as you noticed. So I need some help sometimes. But I would like to ask you about elections. I think it's... November 5. So, I don't know why I do that, but sometimes I watch Fox News here because I want to understand what these people are talking about. And it's interesting how the racism is like something that they are not ashamed to express, and a lot of people related to that. The migration issues, the way they treat the xenophobia, all that thing. But we are talking before, and you told me that a lot of white people here, even working class people, are supporting this idea. There are people from other communities that are supporting this idea because they feel connect in this idea of anti-Black people. And I would like you to explain a little bit about that, and how do you think that, you know, Trump supporters are managing to feel related to these issues, even though if they are part of oppressed groups?
Whew. So I think first and foremost, there are many white Americans who live in communities whereby either there's been pretty significant demographic changes, or there's been pretty significant economic changes, which is to say, the plant has left the community, industry has left the community, and Trump and other sort of propagandists like Trump have essentially said to these people that the source of your challenges, the source of your pain, the reason why you're struggling are because of, let's say, immigrants. Immigrants are coming and they are taking your jobs, they're taking your livelihood, they're taking your culture, they're taking your civilization. The government is protecting them, supporting them, funding them, and denying things to you. And I think this is part of a larger global effort to sort of demonize, particularly immigrants of color, as replacers. So this is happening in France. Marine Le Pen is saying the same thing. It's happening in Holland. Geert Wilders is saying that quote unquote Muslim immigrants are sort of coming and destroying, the country. And I think for people who hold such strong ideas that they should be privileged, that they are superior, that the country is theirs, that the country is white, that white people made the country quote unquote great. These ideas have a pretty seductive appeal. And the other thing I think that's happening simultaneously is, I think, with people of color. So you have African Americans who are also being fed the same idea that those Black and brown immigrants are coming and taking their job, or coming and taking their livelihood. And in many cases, there is ethnic strife between, let's say, different groups of Black people. So typically, you have African Americans who are learning about Black immigrants from white people, and you have Black immigrants who are learning about African Americans from white people, and they're seeing each other through white eyes and demeaning each other from those ideas, but then also calling themselves free thinkers. And there's a long history to that. Actually, in How to Be Anti-Racist, I talk about how that human traders, of African people typically separated different groups, ethnic groups of Black people, and ranked them based on who they imagined made the best quote unquote slave. and those who they imagined made the best quote unquote slave were better than those who were not. So then they were priced higher. And so literally human traders made this massive hierarchy among people now who are considered Black. And in many cases, you've had people along that hierarchy who have accepted and internalized the idea that they're higher than another group of Black people, while rejected the idea that they're lower than another group of Black people, even though literally somebody is feeding them both ideas. So I think that's happening simultaneously. And then you also have Latino and Asian Americans who are anti-Black. You have Black Americans who are anti-Latino and anti-Asian. So I think when we don't have a more holistic conception of racist ideas, that there aren't just anti-Black racist ideas, they're anti-Asian, anti-Native, anti-Latino, and anti-MENA, and it allows people to consume and internalize those ideas, cause them to believe that they're better than those other groups, cause them to believe that those other groups are gaining and getting what they're not. And then that then opens them up to be preyed upon by a predator like Trump.
Yes, I have another question. Then you can ask me, because you now I'm here, the students, you said about all these complex issues, and we watched one interview that you gave a couple years ago in the class today, and you say that a person cannot become a racist. And it was another topic of discussion in the class today, because many students felt that, yes, people can become racist, but you say that it's not a stable concept. And I'd like you to explain a little bit about that, because in Brazil, for example, a lot of authors that I read, they defend this idea that people become racists. And for us, it was such a new approach on that. And I'd like you to explain a little bit about.
So this largely came to me studying and writing about white abolitionists. And so you had white abolitionists who, on the one hand, would call for immediate emancipation. And, they would put their lives on the line. They organized organizations like the American Anti-Slavery Society, a whole host of other organizations, fighting for that anti-racist policy of immediate emancipation, arguing that sort of enslaved people and free people were equal in terms of their humanity. But some of those same abolitionists, even some of the most radical white abolitionists, also made the case in the same articles, in the same speeches, that slavery was so horrific, slavery was so dehumanizing, it literally has made Black people into brutes. Like, they would use that terminology. Indeed, William Lloyd Garrison, who was probably the most famous white male abolitionist, in his introduction to Frederick Douglass's autobiography, he described Black people as more or less like brutes. But of course, he then said Black people have the capacity to rise up and be developed. And that was challenging those enslavers who were like, no, they're actually subhuman, will always be subhuman. I'm mentioning this because it is undoubtedly the case that when these white abolitionists would say that slavery needs to end right now, they were articulating an anti-racist idea. But to me, it's also the case when they would argue that slavery has dehumanized Black people, that they were articulating a racist idea. And so then, how do we identify them as racist or anti-racist? Like, what do we say that they, quote unquote, are. Who quote, are they if in the same speeches or the same articles or in the same campaigns, they are articulating or supporting both racist and anti-racist ideas and policies. So what I realized is, well, actually, what if we recognize that human beings are complex, human beings are contradictory, and the same human being can express racist and anti-racist ideas depending on the context, depending on the racial group they're talking about, depending on the issue, which means that when a person is saying that racist idea, they're being racist. When a person is saying that anti-racist idea, they're being anti-racist, which is to say these are terms that describe what a person is being in any given moment based on what they're saying or doing or not doing, as opposed to who a person essentially is. The other thing I should also add is that when we essentialize someone as a racist or as a, quote, not racist, or even as an anti-racist, that doesn't give people who we essentialize as racist the opportunity to what? Transform themselves. And even that gives those of us who imagine that we're not racist or anti-racist, we don't have to do anything anymore. We're done. I became anti-racist. I've read Jamila's book, so I'm good. Right? And which to me is just as problematic, right? And so to me, you know, that's how I ended up sort of landing on that. And I just think it's more applicable based on how human beings actually are in the world. And, you know, I should ask you, so in the US context, quota is like a horrible bad word. And you just sort of described, particularly in the 21st century, how these quotas were introduced in Brazilian universities. Was there any pushback? Or I should say there probably was pushback, but like what was the rhetoric around the pushback? And did they draw from sort of US racist thought that have long sort of pushed back against quotas as, quote, anti-white?
Yes, in the beginning of the implementation of quotas in Brazil, it was a very hard conversation, especially in mainstream media. So a lot of white people who were against that. But 2001, the first university to adopt quota, State University of Rio de Janeiro, was a pioneer. And today, this university there in this university, there are a high rate of Black students in this university today. Of course, that there are a lot of pushbacks in Brazil, especially under Bolsonaro administration, that he disenfranchised politics in terms of education, housing, the law in different aspects. But I think that if today the federal quota law was established for 10 years. And under Bolsonaro administration, completely 10 years. President Lula did that last year when he became president again. So he renewed the federal quota law for more 10 years. So even though there were a lot of people trying to push back, even though today there are a lot of people criticizing quota, but institutionally it was approved. So, and there were other state universities that adopt quota as well. So in terms of the public debate, we can see a lot of people against, but in institutional terms, these kind of policies are being kept. And not only affirmative actions, but politics like in terms of education, who created more universities in Brazil. I'm part of these public policies in Brazil. I'm the first person in my family to go to university due to these kind of policies. I studied in a campus that was founded in 2007. So it's very recent that we started to establish this kind of policies in Brazil. But of course, there are, today, especially on social media, people who says that quotas are like, you are benefiting Black people and all that things. But the good news is that in an institutional level, we are keeping these kind of policies that changed the reality of universities in Brazil in the past few years. So if today we are talking about racism in the public debate, it's because there were a lot of Black people that they have the opportunity to go to university and to teach in universities and to write books. And we see the reflex of that today in Brazil, but of course, dealing all the time with this attempt of backlash all the time. So, but at the same time, I think that if we advance it in terms of education, in terms of public security, Brazil is a nightmare because there are a lot of police brutality in Brazil, even under left-wing governments, and it's something that you should talk as a society, the naturalization of the police violence against the Black youth in Brazil. We are the 5th country in terms of feminicide. So there are a lot of violence against Black people and women in Brazil, and subjects that we needed to face. But I think that, as you said, a lot of oppressed group reproducing oppressing ideas, and sometimes you can find people, even in the Black movement, that are against feminism, or white feminists that are against the Black movement, and so on, and do not understand that we should fight against the same structure. But yes, we have some progress in these terms, but on the other hand, I think it's impossible to talk about projects in Brazil, a project of a country, without addressing the topic on police brutality in Brazil. We have a data, it's like absurd. In the the state of Bahia, as I told you, it's a Black state in Brazil. So in 1 year, the police in Bahia killed more than all the United States. So we are talking about that. So yes, we have to celebrate the advances in terms of education for sure. We have to acknowledge that I'm part of this generation. But on the other hand, there are some racist policies that we need to acknowledge in Brazil. But it's very naturalized, the criminalization of poverty, the criminalization of favelas, slums in Brazil, the debate on drugs in Brazil, war on drugs actually are war on Black people, and how people do not understand that it's connected to racism. So when I arrived here in New York, for me, it was like, I saw a lot of people smoking pot in the streets. And I was like, wow, because in Brazil, you can't do that. And I was very amazed by that because, I live close to Washington Square, so you can imagine, I can smell pot all day. People are smoking in the streets. But at the same time, I was thinking, who are supporting this kind of rights here in the United States? Because in Brazil, if a Black young man is caught, smoking in the street, the police are going to arrest him because he's smoking. So at the same time, I think about the relation between the global North and the global South, and how the global South is sustaining the privilege in the global North. And that's the question that I want to ask you, because you address that in your book when you talk about climate change and how the global north are taking advantage of this debate. And for me, it was a great joy to see that, because he usually thinkers from United States, even the Black thinkers, they do not look up to the global South when they are discussing racism. So when I'm here in the United States, and I came here a lot before leaving here, I had the opportunity to hold talks in different universities. And when I am among Black people in the United States, not necessarily they will see me as a sister. Oh, no, you are a Latina. Yes, it happens. So that's why I think it's important. Of course, Black people in the United States, they are not hegemonic. But in terms of, look up to the situation in Brazil that Black people who speak Portuguese, the only country in South America where Portuguese is the official language, and language is a barrier to us, to be able to learn a second language in Brazil, have to pay. So you are not learning Spanish as a second language, even though we are in South America. So I want to ask you that, because for me it was very interesting to see that in your book, because we are not used to see that from intellectuals from the United States. And I'd like you to talk a little bit more about this relation as Global North and Global South, and how racism is a global project.
Well, first, I should say, I think that inspiration largely comes from my just reading of the life and work of first W.B. Du Bois, who wrote quite a bit on the world, and even Malcolm X. And I think what's striking, I should say, about Malcolm X, particularly in this moment, is you have a number of particularly African Americans who admire Malcolm X tremendously, quote Malcolm X, but do not want to acknowledge that by the end of his life, Malcolm went from being a Black nationalist to he started to use terms like Black internationalist. And he spent the better part of the last year of his life outside of the United States. And he wrote quite a bit about sort of the necessity for global Black unity. And he sought to organize Black people, particularly through the UN. And so I think particularly in this context, in this xenophobic context, particularly a level of xenophobia within the African-American community among people who claim to admire Malcolm X, just the hypocrisy, for me, is striking to say the least. And I mentioned W. Du Bois because he, in 1919, he organized a Pan-African Congress and organized a few of them over the course of the 1920s. He was inspired by people like Booker T. Washington and others who organized the first Pan-African Congress in 1900. And so I think at least the people that I've been reading, or even as someone like a Maya Angelou, who of course spent a lot of her life in Ghana, for them, they long understood Black people in other countries as their sisters and brothers. And if anything, because African Americans didn't feel like home in their own home, there was this sense that they needed to almost create a sort of a global home through this sort of Pan-African unity. And you know, I in a way feel that, so to speak. Like, I think, you know, I've never fully felt at home in the United States. Just as when I go to other countries, I don't feel like home. But I do feel a sense of home through a sort of connection to other Black people. And I think that that's what sort of is critically important to even understand the history of African Americans, this sort of longing for home, which I suspect there are probably some similarities with Black Brazilians. And but I also just think that to really understand this sort of history of the world, you know, particularly, you know, as a Black thinker, you just can't understand it in a national context, right? Because particularly the modern world, particularly through capitalism, which has always been a, you know, a global construct, and racism has long been a global construct, and they've long intersected. I mean, it just, you know, what's happening to African Americans or Black Americans is in many ways can be explained by what's happening to other people. And so I've learned so much about the Black American experience by looking abroad. And that's why I encourage, you know, my peers to do the same. You know, I'm curious about many people have compared Bolsonaro and Trump, and I heard that Bolsonaro, please correct me if I'm wrong, he once said that he's not racist because back when he was a soldier, he apparently saved a Black guy's life, so that means, quote unquote, he can't be racist. Just as Trump has said he's the least racist person there is, you know, anywhere in the world. So I'm just curious if you could just speak a little bit more, particularly as it relates to Bolsonaro and others who are supporters of Bolsonaro, this level of denialism, because that's even happening in the US context, particularly through Trumpism.
Yes, most of the Bolsonaro supporters are white men in Brazil, most of the Bolsonaro supporters. But for sure, there are people, you know, Black people and women who support Bolsonaro. And I think that it's because these people related somehow with him because, you know, politics of identity, it's different than identity as, you know, how can I say, a political identity, the way people feel connected to each other. So in Brazil, today, the Neo-Pentecostal Church, the evangelical religion in Brazil, especially the Neo-Pentecostal Church, they have a political project in Brazil. These people, they are running for the Congress, for, you know, governors and mayors. And there are a lot of these churches in Brazil, especially in poor neighborhoods, especially in favelas. And these people, they are so, you know, most of the people who live there are Afro-Brazilians, poor people. And the church play a very important role in that context where the state is not present in terms of public policies. So, you know, you can find an old lady that goes often to the church, and the church distribute food for their family. And then the pastor says you have to vote for Bolsonaro because he's a Christian. And she believe that. because that place that she goes, it's a place that she finds some kind of, affect. She feel that she belongs to that place. So, and sometimes people in Brazil, they don't know how to talk to these people. Usually you think, it's a Bolsonaro supporter, and then we have to, do not talk to this person. And I think you have to make the distinction. One thing is the guy who wants to really hate people and they really support hate ideas. I don't have to talk with this kind of people. But on the other hand, there are these very simple people who do not have access to rights in Brazil that feel connect somehow with this kind of, this kind of ideas that Bolsonaro says. And sometimes you can talk about, but he said something like, I don't rape you because you do not deserve. How can you support him? Oh, no, but he's a Christian. So sometimes it's difficult to understand people's minds. But on the other hand, I think we needed to be able to understand that these people there, they are part of, they are so excluded, they want to feel part anyhow. So, for example, a black man in a favela, for example, the police will stop him all the time. But if he is wearing a suit with his Bible, the police will not stop him. So the religion brings to him some kind of respect in that environment. So that's why you do not, we can't just say, oh, he's a Bolsonaro supporter, and he's a black man, and this and that. But how can you understand the context that make this man support a guy like Bolsonaro? So that's why I think it's so important to try to understand that. On the other hand, most of the Lula supporters are black and women, on the other hand. Of course, there are black people who support Bolsonaro, but it's very important to say that most of Bolsonaro supporters are white men, rich white men, that are defending their privileges. And sometimes I think people like to, oh, she's a black woman and she supports Bolsonaro. Jamila, what do you have to say about that? And sometimes I think, she's a human being. I don't ask all my white friends, when I see a white person who supports Bolsonaro, oh, give explanation about that, But they think that you have to respond for all the group. But I truly think that it's important to understand what makes these people support Bolsonaro and how these churches, they have a lot of power in these communities. They own TV channels in Brazil. We are talking about that. The Universal Church owns a TV channel in Brazil, a very popular one. And they can broadcast all day their ideas. We do not have a TV channel and mainstream media, to talk about, anti-racist ideas. So we are talking about all this power that these people have and how they are managing to spread these kind of ideas in poor communities. And I think the left wing in Brazil need to stop being so arrogant sometimes. And, I am here, I know these people is dumb, and try to actually talk to people. Because sometimes people are, in some pedestal, trying to teach each other and speaking for instead of talking to people, to bring people to the conversation. So, yes, we are facing now a very difficult time in Brazil, especially in the city hall election. In São Paulo, people are, actually beating each other, Yes, there was a candidate that took a chair in the other one. No, he threw a chair in the other one. In national television. And I was here in New York thinking, what's happening in Brazil, So these kind of things are being so naturalized. How can we allow this kind of things to happen? And these guys continue to run to be mayor of the major city of the country. So yeah, I think that Bolsonaro lost the election, but he didn't lose his supporters. There are a lot of supporters of Bolsonaro in Brazil. The actual governor of the state of São Paulo is a Bolsonaro supporter. Rio de Janeiro, the same. So he lost the election for president, but his supporters are running a lot of states and cities in Brazil. Well, but again, Black people and women saved the country in the last election. Very important to say. Although there are a lot of people from the left wing that call us, identitarians, they call us like identitários, like we are so fixed on identity. But yes, the identitários saved the country again. I have a question for you about the to face the neutral, because you said that there's no such thing as a neutral policy. And it's interesting because white people, they can be against affirmative actions because they think they are universals and how they don't mark themselves as a race. So do you think that's one of the reasons that they truly believe in neutral, because they continue to see themselves as universal instead of specifics?
Yes. I mean, racist ideas suggest that to be human is to be white. Racist ideas suggest that global history, world history is the history of white people. Racist ideas suggest that literature has been written by white people. Civilization was created by white people. But I think even in a more technical sense, specifically as it relates to policies, I think the debate in the US context around affirmative action, and even the way that is written by the New York Times or the Washington Post, and I guess what I'm speaking about is you even have mainstream reporters who use terms like race blind, race neutral, versus race conscious, which they call affirmative action. And these are terms that literally were created by the opponents of affirmative action. They described affirmative action policies, particularly in college admissions, as quote unquote race conscious. And then they described all other policies as race neutral, even if those policies like legacies, like essay standardized test scores, like giving boosts to students, I should say, to children of employees of universities, giving boosts to relatives of donors, giving boosts to college students who are athletes, and the vast majority of athletes who are college students are white, because not everybody plays basketball and football. They consider those to be race neutral. And so to me, I've pushed back against that, because part of what's happened is those who are trying to maintain racist policies in the United States want us to assess whether a policy is racist based on its intent and based on whether it has racial language in the policy. And clearly, when you assess a policy as racist based on intent, you can easily hide intent. It's very easy to do, right? And then if you assess a policy as only racist if it has racial language in it, then that's also, it's pretty easy to use a number of proxies for race. And indeed, they've been doing that since they were suppressing Black voters in the South through literacy tests and grandfather clauses and poll taxes. And so it even completely ignores American history and how Jim Crow segregationists were using what now is considered race-neutral policies to suppress and oppress Black people. But now those policies are considered racist, but the race-neutral policies in our context are considered race-neutral. This doesn't make sense to me. But this is the sort of mentality, and so that's why I've urged the American people to assess policies as racist or even anti-racist based on their outcome. Don't matter about the intent, doesn't matter about the language and the policies. Is the policy maintaining or growing racial inequity or even injustice? Or is it doing the opposite, sort of closing those gaps? And so now we can take a rigorous and empirical and data-driven assessment of policies to see what type of effect they're having. But then that also, there's a tremendous amount of opposition to that. I mean, I can't tell you how much I've been slammed for suggesting that we should assess policies based on outcome as opposed to intent. And even suggesting that the disparities and inequities that exist in this country are based on policies, not the inferiority of particular groups of people. Like, that somehow is a radical idea. Like, are you saying all? Yeah, actually don't think Black people or Native folks or any other racial group are inferior in any way. And typically when you defend why a particular racial group is more likely to be incarcerated or impoverished or dying of heart disease or cancer or suspended from school or expelled, or you typically argue that it's because there's something culturally, behaviorally, even genetically wrong with that group of people. And you've never demonstrated that. And so I think after hundreds of years of you making a case that there's this racial hierarchy and you haven't proven your case, at some point we should just say, you know what? The earth is round, people are equal.
Yes. And if allow me, I'd like to add another question, because in the book you say that racial discrimination is not always a bad thing. Can you explain a little bit more?
Yeah, so in countries like particularly United Kingdom, even Australia, a few other European countries, there's this, they distinguish between what they call positive discrimination and negative discrimination. And I think the reason for that there's a recognition in society that, let's say, ensuring that people who make $50,000 are not paying the same rate of taxes as people who make $5 billion, that's actually positive discrimination, right? Versus negative discrimination, which is what happens in the US context, which is when people who are making $50,000 are actually paying more in taxes than people who make $5 billion, right? Or in the case of, I think during the COVID-19 pandemic in the United States, the government decided that it was going to make the vaccine available first to elderly people. That was after, of course, medical workers. Now, why did they make the vaccine available first to elderly people? Because they were dying at the highest rates from COVID-19. In a very technical sense, they were discriminating against young people. But that's positive discrimination because they were dying at the highest rates versus giving vaccine first to younger people who were dying at the lowest rates is what these scholars in the UK and others would call negative discrimination. The reason why this is important in the US context is because how do we go about eradicating centuries of discriminatory and I should say racist policies if we can't acknowledge that a particular group is dying at the highest rates and that a particular group of people need more in order for us to create equity. But most Americans at the most will say, yes, you have $500,000 and I have $5, but you should both receive the same. And that's justice. That's the most Americans will do. And then they'll claim, well, if that person who has $500,000 continues generation after generation to have more, it's because they're superior to the person who started off with $5 because of generations of racism. And I'm like, no, we need to have this hard conversation. But most Americans don't want to have that conversation. They don't want to talk about affirmative action or even reparations. And so as a result, I get attacked. It's described that I'm advocating for anti-white racism. So those of us who are actually serious about eliminating the racial wealth gap, we're somehow against white people because they imagine this is a zero-sum game, that if you give to one group, you're taken away from another group, when that actually doesn't have to be the case. I have two girls. If one of my girls has 4 cookies, I can actually, and another one has 2 cookies, I can just give the one who has 2 cookies 2 extra cookies. So they both have 4. I don't need to take one away. But that's how they use that concept to sort of scare white people, to generate anger among white people, to oppose equity and anti-racist initiatives, because they want them to believe that they're going to lose, when in reality, they're likely going to gain.
And sometimes how these white people, they don't realize that their situations sometimes are more similar to Black people, their neighbor, than the white rich people. And the lack of awareness on that, because they don't have, sometimes they relate it in terms of race, but they do not understand that they are being oppressed in terms of class sometimes. So sometimes your neighbor are living, even though a Black person, of course, you live in a different way, but they don't see like that. Especially white poor people. That's the white rich people that are oppressing them, not anti-racist policies too, It's something that in Brazil, it's very common as well.
And actually I have a question in that sense, because so you mentioned, and I think this is happening in the US, in which even white Americans who acknowledge the history of slavery and Jim Crow, which means they acknowledge that for roughly 350 years, there were policies on the book that deprived Black people of rights, of power, of wealth. Similarly, you mentioned how in the late 19th century, early 20th century, that Brazil decided to whiten its society by recruiting as many Europeans to the country as possible and gave them land and privileges, while the Black folk who had been there hundreds of years were like, wait, what about us? And so in the debate around anti-racist policies today, are the white people who are descendants of those white immigrants who were literally given land and advantages and privileges that Black people were denied, just completely ignoring that history?
Yes. In Brazil, there is the largest Italian community outside Italy, the largest Japanese community outside Japan, and there are also some German descent especially in the south of Brazil, who, whom their ancestors were benefited by this, this affirmative action, actually. A lot of Black intellectuals in Brazil call this act of Brazilian state to donate land to immigrants people as one of the first affirmative actions policy in the history of Brazil. And it's very interesting because of all these contests that we have in Brazil, because of the racial democracy myth. So a lot of people, they really think that everybody is coming from the same starting points. And of course that white people also, they have the privilege of the ignorance sometimes. But when we are discussing quotas, I remember that I had a colleague in university that who was Italian descent and who was against affirmative actions policies for Black people. And I told him, your ancestor received the land. It was also an affirmative action, and now you're against an affirmative action for my people. Oh, I didn't know that. And this is the problem.
So they don't know their own family history?
They don't know. So
make the connection.
They don't make the connection, and sometimes they just want to be like, oh, I didn't know, because it's easier, because they don't want to deal with uncomfortable truths, as Grada Quilomba, a Portuguese thinker, used to say. So in Brazil, there are a lot of white people who descend from these, people in Europe, and they are very proud of the European heritage. So they can have double citizenship. They can have an Italian passport, a Portuguese passport, and they really think that they are European until they really go to Europe and see that they are not. And this kind of sense of superiority prevent them to feel connected with the reality of the other Brazilian people. So in Brazil, they destroyed all documents related to the slavery. So I don't know if my ancestors came from Nigeria or if they came from, I don't know, Kenya. I don't know, because they destroyed it. And when they did that, they prevented us to feel connected with our history. So I would like to have a Nigerian passport, maybe if I knew if my ancestor came from Nigeria. So I had to do a DNA test, and the result was that I am 85% from Nigeria, but I don't have the right to ask for a Nigerian passport. So it's interesting how in Brazil they create this kind of European sense of superiority to white people. And it's very common to hear white people say, no, my grandfather, he was from Italy. And then it makes him a sense of superiority. Even though he's your neighbor, living in the same neighborhood, no, but at least my ancestor came from Europe. So these people, for me, it's a work to talk about that in Brazil, because you were benefit, your ancestors were benefit. That's why you today do not have to face the same reality than the Black people, because, the first university to adopt quotas was in 2001. It's very recent. So a lot of Afro-Brazilian people, a lot of generation was condemned to exclusion in Brazil. The fact that I am the first person in my family to go to university, of course, it's good, but it means that it took so long for that to happen. And there are a direct relation between slavery in Brazil and domestic work. So when the slavery was abolished, there were any kind of reparation policies for Black people. There are not any kind of reparation policies for Black people. So that Black women who were enslaved, started to work as domestic worker. And until today in Brazil, most of the domestic workers are Black women. So, and I can relate it to the history in my family because my mom was a domestic worker until married my father. My grandmother was, my great-grandmother, and before then, they were enslaved. So the cycle of exclusion was broken in my family, very recent. So that's why it's so important to people to acknowledge that and to understand if they are Italian descent, living a different reality than Black people, it's because their ancestor, a long time ago, were benefit by the Brazilian state. And sometimes these people, they want to, also cause, I didn't know, or you Black people have to teach me all the time. Sometimes, I am, I don't know, in my happy hour in Brazil, and some people approach me, oh, Jamila, racism in Brazil, and I say, oh my God, today I just want to drink a beer. So, because, so I don't want to talk about racism right now. I buy the book and do your work, So they are all, postponing the awareness, postponing the revolution, because it's a comfort place to be sometimes. So that's why I think work like yours is important, because people need to be part of the conversation, especially in Brazil, a country that we have this contest to deny racism. As Lélia Gonzalez, a very important Afro-Brazilian intellectual, used to say that the Brazilian society is neurotic, because at the same time that they deny racism and treat black people in a very prejudiced way, what people know about Brazil outside Brazil? They know samba, they know carnival, they know caipirinha, they know feijoada, which is the most popular dish in Brazil. So at the same time that they want to keep Black people in margins, they call the Afro-Brazilian culture as Brazilian culture to, to outside Brazil. And it's very interesting how that's why Lélia Gonzalez used to say that the Brazilian society is neurotic, because what we have, the best, comes from Black people. What we have more popular in the country, outside the country. And that's why they try to whitening, the figures in this kind of culture. And sometimes they make popular a white man singing samba instead of a Black man. So Brazilian society needs to face these neuroses and really acknowledge the power of Black people and our role in the formation of the society, and how it's important to Black people also to acknowledge that you are not only victims of an oppression, we are subjects who are resisting, fighting against, and creating and producing. But in the same time, they don't want, they in Brazil, it's very common, a white person that, loves the Black culture, but they are against affirmative actions. They want to go to candomblé, as I told you, the African Brazilian religion, but they want to vote for a candidate that support racist policies. So again, these neuroses again. So no, I love Black people. I dance samba, I go to candomblé, but I vote for Bolsonaro. So sometimes this person cannot understand how, neurotic it is, because he is a guy who are supporting racist policies. So this kind of lack of awareness in Brazil sometimes can be very exhausting, because white people continue, things are changing now. It's important to say things are changing now. White people are starting to make part of the conversation. There are some white people studying about critical whiteness that I think is so important to white people to do that. But yes, we have still a long way to go on that.
Yeah, and as Black Americans say, they love the culture, but not necessarily the people. So I think we can open it up for questions.
Yes.
I think
I'm sorry. Was
No,
it
you're
just
good.
talking?
This has been an amazing conversation. So originally we were going to have the mic stand up here, but I think for efficiency of time, we're going to have time for probably about 2 or 3 questions.
Hello, my name is Maria. I have a question for you both. You guys talked about, most importantly for DJAMILA, you talked about the role of the Pentecostal church, the Christian church in Brazil's favela. I'm interested if you can kind of delve more into how the role that they play into factions, the organized crimes, and how that creates, how should I put it, how that creates a divide and between Christianity and candomblé, because a lot of those kids in organized crime often blame the candomblé because of the way that they live their life. And I want to tie that question to Christianity within the Black community in the US, the African American community, and how Christianity plays a role into conspiracy theory and how it drives the Black community into more conservative ideas.
Yes, it's a very interesting question because in Brazil, there are things like Christian drug dealers, Yes, there are.
Wait.
They are in favelas, yes, destroying terreiros like the Candomblé temple. They are there destroying terreiros, beating people from Candomblé, and they have agreement. The church has an agreement with some factions, some criminals in Brazil. And sometimes it can be very difficult to understand that, but it's happening. It's like a way to prevent Black people in favelas to be part of other religions and to be only in evangelical church. There are some people who says that some churches are washing the money of the traffic as well. Maybe it's a point of view that I think that's very consistent, because why these people are doing that. But there is this kind of, violence that comes from these drug dealers who are supported by churches in favelas to prevent people to go to candomblé and, to support the idea that these people had to vote in whom they say that people have to vote. So there are some milícias in Brazil. I don't know how to say in English, milícias. Militias, yes, there are some militias in Brazil that they come from, they have the support of some evangelical church as well. They can be former police officers. They are acting in these territories in Brazil, especially in favelas in Rio de Janeiro, for example.
Okay. So I'll say very quickly that I think even more, as opposed to Christianity, I actually think that it's really within really all communities, including the Black community, there are, for the lack of a better term, believers and thinkers. And I think believers are much more likely to gravitate towards conspiracy theories that that sort of reinforce the way in which they see or understand the world, that tie into their emotional connection or lack thereof to the government, to a particular group, versus a thinker and who has, and this thinker doesn't necessarily have to be somebody who went to college, right? There are thinkers who are incarcerated, versus a thinker who, of course, is going to assess and measure and really discern the sort of messenger and look for evidence. And I just think unfortunately, there's so many different mechanisms in our society that is training people to be believers as opposed to thinkers.
Thank you. I would like to thank Professor Ribeiro and also Professor Kendi for this amazing opportunity to discuss in this place such an important topic. I'm from Brazil. I'm studying here in the US. And considering the historical dynamics and relationships between the global North and the global South, from the racial perspective in Brazil, even though we're facing economic hardship and social hardship, also we have affirmative actions that Professor Ribeiro explained earlier, and they're effective in terms of Black people, Black community accessing higher education, and also we do have a ministry of racial equity in Brazil. We have private sector initiatives which are open spots, positions, job positions focused on marginalized groups, vulnerable groups, Black people inside of those groups. And on the other hand, here in the US, we've seen a decline of affirmative actions in college admissions, in jobs opportunities, in diversity and inclusion initiatives that are being undermined. So I would like to ask, how can the global North learn from the global South initiatives? Because honestly, we are steps ahead of what is going on here right now. Thank you.
Well, I think first and foremost, in order to learn from, you have to humble yourself too. And I think, unfortunately, to be an American is to imagine yourself to live in the greatest country, on earth. And even you have many Black Americans who believe that. You have certain Black Americans who will both talk about this is the best and the worst country on earth, depending on the context. Which is to say, they don't necessarily need to learn sort of how other movements, how other groups of Black people have sort of won rights and privileges and even affirmative action. And so I just think at a very basic level, it will really involve Black Americans to really humble ourselves, to sort of learn. And I'm saying that particularly in this moment where you have too many Black Americans who are doing the very opposite in relation to particularly Black immigrants.
My name is Dr. Renee Ortega, and I've been going back and forth to Sao Paulo for the last 10 years as part of my dissertation research. And my research focused on intercultural communication skills of healthcare professionals working in the favelas and the psychosocial centers, or the CAP centers, of Sao Paulo, in collaboration with Hospital Santa Marcelina. And as someone who's born and raised in Brooklyn, New York City, all of my work has focused so much on the similarities that exist between Black Brazilian culture and culture here. I'm also a psychotherapist here, and I've been working in the mental health sector for almost 20 years. And so my question to both of you, because all of my work centers around the disparities in healthcare and how rooted they are in colonization and capitalism and white supremacy and all of these things. But I do believe, especially post-COVID, we are in a global mental health crisis. And I think that so much of what's happening as it relates to this mental health crisis is rooted in these policies. And so I would love to hear your position in Brazil and here in the US about how this anti-racist lens or just any thoughts that you have about the relationship between everything that we spoke about tonight and mental health care.
Well, I think it's a fundamental discussion. The mental health care have some important intellectuals as Frantz Fanon, who reflects on that. In Brazil, you have Neuza Santos, who wrote about the psychological damage of racism in Black people. And I think it's a very important discussion. And in Brazil now, I think we are starting to value more this kind of debates. Black people are speaking more about that, the necessity to take care of ourselves. Because for a long time, for us, especially Black women in Brazil, we were supposed to take care of everybody. So there is this kind of imposition for Black women in Brazil. My mom, she passed away when she was 51 years old. She was very young. And yes, she died from cancer, but also from racism and sexism, and people do not relate the oppression, how make people sick. And in Brazil, it's different from United States because in Brazil, we have a public health system. It doesn't work the way it should be, but there is. People in Brazil are not losing their homes because they had a medical issue, like here in the United States. I think our job in Brazil is continue to press. You know, we have to make the health public system in Brazil needs to work more because we know that the people who depend more in the public health system in Brazil. But I think that the mental issue is fundamental for us, and I'm glad that in Brazil, this kind of conversations are starting to become more popular, and Black people understand that they have the right to ask for help, that it's okay to you to say that you are not okay, because, you know, there is this kind of this myth of the strong Black woman in Brazil. And this myth of strong Black women in Brazil are killed a lot of Black women historically, because even in the medical system, the doctors, they gave less anesthesia for Black women, for example, because of this idea that Black woman is strong, or people don't treat them with kindness because, oh no, they are strong, they can deal, they can manage everything. So this kind of ideas was reproduced in the health system. This kind of idea is rooted on racism, sexism in Brazil. During the AIDS in Brazil, there was a process of sterilization of Black women in Brazil during the AIDS and the beginning of the 90s in Brazil. That's why racism is in everything. And that's why I think as Black people, and not only as Black people, as citizens, we have to push this kind of conversations and the creation of public policies on that. I run an institute in São Paulo since 2022, and we provide psychological assistance for free for Black people and Black women, and there is a huge waiting list. And in one hand, it's a problem, the waiting list, but on the other hand, for us, it's important to see that Black women are acknowledging that they have the right to take care of themselves and their mental health.
So I went to Florida A&M University. I don't know if there's any rattlers in the building, I guess not. And when I first started taking Black Studies courses, most of the courses I took were Black psychology courses. At the time, FAMU had a pretty sort of powerful group of Black psychologists. And I mention that because in many ways, I think because of that intellectual start, I've long been thinking about the psychological impact of racist violence, of racist policies, and it's just been something that I think, despite having 40 years of 50 years now of Black psychologists, we're still scratching the surface. For instance, I'm reminded of a recent book that was able to empirically demonstrate that racism leads to physical harm on the body, which a scholar called weathering. But I don't think if it's having a physical effect, right, it's certainly having, a psychological and mental effect. I think we started to have a conversation, particularly within the Black community, around trauma. And I think that conversation is ongoing. I should add, though, I've personally pushed back against the idea that we're a traumatized people, and that as a result of being a traumatized people, we're engaging in all these negative behaviors. To me, that's another way, that's a sort of a part of what I call the oppression inferiority thesis, that sort of a particular group, in this case, Black people, were engaging in inferior behaviors because we're so oppressed. But I think that those scholars who introduced that topic, I think it's really led to conversations about what it means to constantly be traumatized because you heard someone in your community was killed by police. It's a traumatic effect, and more scholars have documented that has an effect on the entire community of Black people, a psychological effect. I've also, in How to Be an Anti-Racist, I used the term racist abuse instead of the term microaggressions, because I felt that the term racist abuse better connoted the effects of when, let's say, a Black person one of you are walking home and you get followed by the police, and then eventually that police peels off, and then you go into a store and you get followed by a clerk, and then you come out the store and there's a white woman with her child walking at you and they cross the street. Like the psychological effect on experiencing that time and again, back to back to back, all day long, right? In a way, it has the same type of effects as abuse, right? But what I haven't done, just because I don't have the expertise, has been to try to figure out how we can help people navigate that and heal and still sort of be whole. And then the other side of this, I should add, is the ideological part, which I do have I feel more equipped, to talk about. Like, what does it mean when a person looks in the mirror and sees danger? Who's Black? What does it mean when a person thinks that they can't achieve because they're Black? Right? What does it mean when a person, a young person, let's say a young Black male, was racially profiled by the police, even beat up, and he comes home and tells his parents, and the first thing his parents says is, "What did you do?" Like, how does that person who's 16 years old, how do they feel about that, right? How do they deal with that emotionally, right? Just like, how does that girl deal with when she was, assaulted, her parents blame her, right? How do we deal with this? And I don't think we have really figured out, how Black people handle being blamed when we are the victim of racist violence. In other words, we're the victims, right? And then we are blamed even by people who we believe love us. Like, how do we negotiate that? I mean, it's very, very difficult. And I think it's something we need to continue to talk about.
I wish we could stay talking for hours more. I know that we're all so grateful for you coming. Thank you, Professor Ribeiro. Thank you, Professor Kendi. We know that this is not the end of a conversation, but a continuing conversation. So I hope, if only Professor Kendi could come back and stay with us for the semester. You know that you have a second home here. You're always welcome. Thank you so much for bringing the conversation to NYU. The people at BU are very fortunate to have you there, and we hope that you'll come back and continue the conversation, if not in person, then through other mechanisms. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you so much.